A wild mustang broke out of his pen at dawn. But what he was trying to show the old man left everyone breathless. At first light, a mustang named Dakota shattered the silence of the desert by leaping out of his pen. But instead of running wild, he kept turning back, calling an old man to follow him. No one knew where that horse was leading, or why his eyes carried such desperate purpose, until the truth rose from the shadows beneath the rocks.
Easy there, little one.
The first light of morning barely grazed the red horizon when Jack Merrick stepped onto the creaking porch of his small desert ranch. The air was crisp in that unmistakable Arizona way, dry enough to sting the lungs, quiet enough for every sound to feel like it traveled miles. He wrapped his calloused fingers around a steaming cup of coffee, letting its warmth settle into his palms. After years working wildfire shifts, he carried a kind of inner stillness people spend their whole lives trying to secure, the sort of quiet no insurance in the world could guarantee. Out here, the only policy he relied on was the sincerity of the land itself, unforgiving but honest. He lifted the cup toward his lips, but a violent crash shattered the morning calm. The sound was sharp, metal against wood, too deliberate to be an accident. Jack froze, eyes narrowing toward the far end of the property. The pen. He didn't run. Old habits had taught him that rushing was rarely the answer in a place where everything sharpens with silence. He walked with slow, measured steps until the scene unfolded before him like something pulled straight from a memory he didn't recognize. Dakota, his newly rescued Mustang, black with a dusting of ash gray, stood coiled like a spring inside the corral. Jack had known the horse was restless, had sensed the storm beneath its skin, but nothing prepared him for what happened next. Dakota launched upward, hooves cutting the air, muscles firing with a grace that felt almost unreal. For a suspended breath, that Mustang hung between earth and sun, the rising light tracing every curve of its powerful form. Then it cleared the top rail, as if gravity had temporarily forgotten its duties. Dakota landed on the other side with a thud that rippled through the ground. Dust rose around the stallion's legs like smoke from an old wildfire, and Jack instinctively steadied himself against the fence post. But the strangest part wasn't the jump. It was what came after. Dakota didn't bolt, didn't flee into the open desert the way a panicked horse would. Instead, the Mustang turned halfway, standing sideways so its body faced the horizon, but its eyes stayed locked on Jack. There was no rage there, no fear, only something that unsettled him far more. Intention. Jack lowered his coffee cup, heartbeat finally catching up with the moment. "What are you doing, boy?" he muttered under his breath, though Dakota made no move to run. The stallion's ears twitched forward, catching every subtle breath, every whisper of wind across the dry red soil. It looked at him, really looked, as though expecting him to understand a language older than their two worlds combined. Dakota gave a rough exhale, a plume of steam rising in the cold morning air, then pivoted and trotted several yards toward the open valley. But again, it stopped. The Mustang turned its head back, fixing Jack with that same unrelenting stare. A silent summons. A beckoning. The kind of wordless urging that tugged at the parts of a man he'd tucked away. Instinct, purpose, responsibility. Jack sighed, the sound slipping out heavier than he meant. He wasn't a man who chased after things anymore, hadn't been for years, not since losing too much to flames and choices that still clung to him like smoke. But something about that horse, about the break in its breath and the certainty in its posture, dug under his ribs. It wasn't running away. It was asking him to follow. He set the cup down on the dirt, letting it tip over and spill into the thirsty ground. A small, amber stream of coffee disappeared into the soil, and he watched it for a moment longer than necessary. Funny, he thought, how easily something can vanish when it has nowhere to hold on. He straightened his old canvas jacket, a habit more than a need, then grabbed the nearest pair of worn gloves from the railing. Dakota remained perfectly still, head turned, muscles tense, but waiting. Jack stepped toward the stallion slowly, half expecting it to bolt, but Dakota stood its ground, as if confirming that Jack had made the decision it needed him to make. The sky brightened behind them, casting a warm outline around the Mustang's silhouette. It felt strangely ceremonial, like crossing an invisible threshold into a day he hadn't planned to live. "All right," Jack murmured, voice rough but steady. "I'm coming." He took another step, then another. Dakota flicked its tail once, sharp, purposeful, and turned toward the open desert. The horse wasn't moving fast, just far enough ahead to lead but close enough to keep Jack in its sight. And as Jack followed, his boots pressing fresh prints into the red earth, he felt the unfamiliar stirring of something he hadn't let himself feel in years. A beginning. A pull toward a truth he didn't yet understand. A journey that had already started before he realized he was part of it. Dakota slowed, just slightly, tilting its head as though checking to see whether Jack was still behind him. And Jack stepped forward into the waking desert, unaware that what waited ahead would break open a silence he had carried for far too long. The desert was quiet, in the way only an endless stretch of red earth could be. Quiet, but never still. Jack followed Dakota at a measured pace, his boots sinking slightly into the powdery sand with each step. The Mustang moved ahead with a steadiness that felt deliberate, its hoofprints forming a crisp trail across the open land. There was nothing hesitant or confused about the pattern the stallion left behind. Every mark formed a straight, unwavering line that cut through the desert like a thought that refused to bend. Jack found himself studying those prints more than the horse itself, noticing how deeply they pressed into the soil as though Dakota was carrying more than its weight. Perhaps carrying a message, or a purpose, or the kind of instinct older than the country beneath their feet. He adjusted the strap of his canteen and kept moving, letting the morning light warm his shoulders. It was strange how following a horse across the desert made the world feel wider but lighter at the same time. Jack wasn't a man who romanticized the past or dressed it in softer colors, but there was something about the stillness stretching ahead of him that made old memories creep closer than he expected. He pushed them aside, focusing instead on Dakota's tail flicking gently in the growing heat. Whatever was pulling the horse forward, it was powerful enough to override every fear a Mustang should have felt after jumping a pen at dawn. The trail weaved through clusters of barrel cactus and brittle scrub brush, their shadows sharp and short in the rising sun. Jack kept his distance, not wanting to pressure Dakota into running. The stallion would pause every few minutes. Never long, just enough to check whether Jack had fallen behind. Each time, Jack caught the faint glimmer of the horse's ash-colored mane catching light like flecks of silver. Dakota was wild, unpredictable, and yet today it behaved as if it had appointed itself a guide. That alone unsettled Jack more than he cared to admit. Animals didn't choose him. They tolerated him. But Dakota was choosing something. A low breeze picked up, carrying with it the mineral scent of sandstone and the dry sweetness of creosote bushes baked by the sun. Jack breathed it in, feeling his lungs stretch against the familiar ache that lived in his ribs. The desert had become his refuge after retirement, a place without alarms, without radios crackling orders, without the crushing weight of decisions made in seconds that changed lives forever. Here, the world slowed enough for a man to live without justifying every breath. Or so he'd believed. But this morning, following Dakota's determined path, he felt the same pull in his chest he used to feel before hiking toward the smoke columns that rose like warnings above the tree line. A feeling that something needed him, whether he felt ready or not. Dakota's pace shifted slightly as they reached a stretch of ground where the earth sloped downward in a long, narrow bend. The Mustang stepped across the decline with the assurance of an animal born knowing the land. Jack followed more cautiously, placing his feet carefully to avoid the loose gravel that gathered in small drifts. He could feel the strain in his knees, the way time had threaded itself through his joints, reminding him that not all weight could be left behind. Still, he pushed on, tracing the path Dakota had carved. For a while, neither man nor horse made a sound. The only noise came from distant ravens crossing the open sky, their wings beating the air like muted drumbeats. Jack watched them briefly, then looked back at Dakota. The Mustang had stopped again, standing still, ears lifted, nostrils flaring as though reading something the desert was whispering just to him. Jack slowed, approaching with the same patient caution he used around injured wildlife years ago. Dakota didn't shy away this time. Instead, the stallion stood firm, planted in the sand, gaze fixed ahead on something Jack couldn't yet see. He came to stand beside Dakota, his breath heavy from the slow hike. They stood together, man and horse, facing a stretch of desert that looked no different from the miles behind them. Same red earth, same scrub brush, same shimmering heat. But Dakota had stiffened, energy coiling beneath its skin, as though the Mustang recognized something Jack could not. "It's not just about getting out, is it?" Jack said quietly, half to himself. Dakota flicked its ear toward him, acknowledging the voice without shifting its focus. Jack felt the desert heat settle on his back, but a chill crept along the inside of his arms. That unbroken line of hoofprints suddenly felt like a message spelled out in a language meant only for him to decipher. The Mustang stepped forward again, slower this time, more cautious than before. Jack followed, his heartbeat syncing oddly with the rhythm of Dakota's hooves pressing into the sand. They descended the rest of the incline in near silence until the ground leveled out into a flatter stretch of earth scattered with small rocks and dried riverbed grooves. Jack dropped to one knee, brushing his fingertips lightly over one of the fresher hoofprints. The indentation was deep, deeper than a horse should have made trotting casually across open ground. Dakota had been moving fast earlier, almost urgently. Now, the prints began to spread farther apart, signaling a shift to a quicker pace that had slowed only when the horse sensed Jack falling behind. He rose to his feet and shaded his eyes, scanning the distance. Dakota's gaze remained locked forward, unwavering. There was a tension in the horse's stance, as though every muscle was tuned to a frequency Jack couldn't hear. He felt his chest tighten in a way that reminded him of smoke, thick air in the old days, except there was no fire here, not one he could see. The wind shifted, brushing past Dakota's mane and carrying the faintest sound across the dry, open space. Jack paused. It was nothing more than a fragile stirring of air, easy to dismiss as imagination. But Dakota had already reacted. Head lifting, ears pricking forward with fierce alertness. The Mustang took 3 steps and stopped, pivoting halfway to make sure Jack was watching. "That's twice you've done that," Jack Bakya murmured. "You want me to follow you, not just trail behind?" Dakota moved again, and Jack complied. They passed a narrow cluster of rocks rising from the earth like the ribs of some long-buried creature. The wind funneled through them, humming in broken tones. Jack slowed, listening. No distinct sound reached him, not yet, but he felt something shift in the air, subtle as a heartbeat. Dakota pressed on, each hoof landing with intention. Jack followed, his steps steady. Then, just as the light changed, brightening from gold to a harsher white, the horse paused once more. Dakota's chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate pattern. Jack came to a stop beside him, eyes narrowed toward the uneven ridge ahead. Whatever Dakota had been leading him toward was close. Close enough to change the way the Mustang breathed. Close enough to make the desert feel as if it were holding its breath alongside them. And as the wind curled through the rocks once more, a faint, trembling sound drifted into the air. Fragile, distant, and enough to make Jack's blood run cold. Dakota stepped forward, waiting for him. Jack swallowed, bracing himself as he followed the Mustang deeper into the quiet that no longer felt like peace. The sound drifted across the open land so faintly that Jack couldn't tell whether it was real or only something his mind shaped out of the quiet. It came and went with the wind, a thin thread of noise carried between the sandstone ridges, like a secret unsure if it wanted to be heard. Dakota stood absolutely still, every line of its body sharpened by tension. The Mustang's ears tilted forward, searching the air, and Jack felt the horse's breath stutter in a way that made the hair on his arms rise. Whatever Dakota was hearing, it wasn't the wind. The desert, vast and sun-drenched, had suddenly narrowed itself into a single point ahead of them, as if everything beyond this moment waited to see what Jack would do next. He stepped forward, boots crunching lightly over gravel. Dakota matched him, not with urgency, but with a kind of measured resolve. Jack noticed how the stallion's movements had changed. Earlier, Dakota walked like it wanted him to keep up. Now, it walked like it needed him to understand. He adjusted his pace, letting a natural rhythm settle between them, man and horse moving in an unspoken partnership. For a quiet second, the desert's breath seemed to hang around them, suspended like dust in sunlight. As they approached the rise of a narrow canyon wall, Jack slowed. The ground dipped in a subtle way, just enough to force him to shift his balance. Dakota moved ahead a few feet, then stopped where the slope deepened into a shallow trough. Jack followed more cautiously, placing his steps with the instinct of someone used to unstable ground. His foot nudged a scatter of loose stones, sending them rolling down with soft clicks that echoed longer than they should have. Jack straightened, feeling the desert's silence return as though swallowing even those small sounds. The faint noise came again. Not wind, not rock. Something alive. He stopped breathing for a moment, listening. It was like a thin whimper wrapped in exhaustion, muffled by distance or stone. Dakota lifted its head higher, nostrils flaring, then took a single step toward the sound. Jack felt a shift inside himself, small but unmistakable, as though he'd just opened a door he didn't realize he'd kept locked for years. He walked beside Dakota down the slope until the landscape opened into a shallow valley cradled between 2 long mesas. The terrain here changed, the ground hardened, no longer soft red soil, but a patchwork of cracked earth and pale rock. Jack recognized this part of the desert, an old, dried riverbed that once carved its way through the land. Now, only scars remained. It was the kind of place where sound traveled strangely, bending around stone and returning in pieces. Dakota paused again, where the riverbed curved gently to the left. The Mustang lowered its head, studying the earth as though reading something written there. Jack crouched beside the horse, resting one hand lightly on the ground to steady himself against the incline. The soil felt cold, colder than it should have been under the morning sun. He pressed his palm a little deeper, feeling that same chill travel up his arm. Something didn't belong here. Jack rose slowly, letting his gaze sweep the valley. The shadows pooled deeper between the rocks, gathering in patches that made the canyon walls seem taller than they were. He watched the horizon, the light shifting as clouds drifted across the sun. Moments like this always reminded him of standing beneath smoke columns, when the world turned quiet in all the wrong ways, holding its breath before deciding whether to break or spare what lay beneath it. Dakota nudged his arm gently, a soft prod, a reminder. Jack exhaled and followed the stallion around the bend of the old riverbed. The faint sound became clearer, still small, still thin, but unmistakably real. It pulsed weakly, like a heartbeat losing tempo. Jack stopped again, narrowing his eyes toward the source. The land dipped sharply a few yards ahead, creating a crevice where water once pooled during monsoon season. The edges of the rock looked jagged, brittle, as though chipped away by time and sudden force. Dakota moved closer, planting its hooves firmly at the rim of the dip. Jack stepped to the Mustang's side and peered into the broken earth. At first, he saw nothing but shadow and scattered brush. Then, as his eyes adjusted, a shape began to take form, small, dark, trembling. He squinted, leaning in as far as he safely could. A foal, a tiny Mustang, trapped somewhere deeper than the eye could reach, its faint cry blending with the stone's cold echo. Jack's breath caught, not from fear, not from surprise, but from a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to touch in years. The obligation to act, no matter the risk, no matter the cost. The old instincts rose inside him like sparks from a dying campfire, slow at first, then brighter, warmer, more demanding. He'd buried those instincts when he left the wildfire service, burying them alongside the regret he carried like a scar. Dakota stamped the ground once, a sharp, urgent sound. Jack looked at the stallion, and Dakota's eyes held a glossy tremor, something close to desperation. It wasn't fear for itself. It was fear for what lay beneath them. Jack placed a hand on the horse's neck, feeling the taut muscles tighten beneath his fingers. Dakota leaned into the touch, just enough to tell him he wasn't imagining that urgency. He swallowed hard, taking a slow step backward to assess the terrain. The mouth of the crevice was narrow, not wide enough for Dakota to approach safely. The edge was fragile, crumbling slightly under his weight as he tested it. Jack knelt, brushing away the surface dust to expose a more stable patch of stone underneath. The sound came again, slightly louder, trembling with exhaustion. Jack rose, glancing back the way they came. The vast expanse of desert seemed oddly still, its golden white light shining over the canyon like some silent witness. He wasn't sure how far they were from his ranch, far enough that shouting wouldn't reach a soul, far enough that turning back now would cost time the foal didn't seem to have. Dakota took another step toward him, lowering its head until its muzzle nearly touched Jack's shoulder. Jack steadied the Mustang with one hand, feeling the warmth of its breath against his back. "All right," he whispered, though he wasn't yet sure who he was speaking to. The foal, the desert, or the part of himself he'd sworn would stay quiet forever. "We're close. I hear it." Dakota exhaled, a sound softer than wind. Jack bent again, peering into the dark opening, trying to see where the depth ended and the foal lay. It was too deep to pull the animal out alone. He would need help. Someone who could get here quickly. Someone who wouldn't question why he followed a horse across miles of open land. A faint tremor of sound echoed up from the crevice. Dakota started shifting its weight again. Jack steadied the Mustang with both hands. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm not leaving." But he would have to leave, briefly. He needed Sam. And as he stood again, dust clinging to the knees of his jeans, the desert fell into a hush so complete that even the ravens circling high above went silent, as if the land itself waited for him to make the next move. The sound rose again, thinner this time, like a thread fraying at its end, while the morning light thickened over the canyon walls. Jack knelt at the rim of the crevice, leaning in just far enough for his shadow to spill down the jagged stone. Dakota hovered behind him, shifting its weight with an anxious energy Jack could feel more than hear. The Mustang's breath brushed the back of his neck in warm bursts, steady but urgent, as if urging him to see not just with his eyes, but with something deeper. Jack steadied himself, bracing one hand against the stone as he peered farther into the shadowed space below. At first, the crevice appeared empty, only a jumble of broken rocks and strips of dried brush. But then, a faint movement broke the stillness. A small, trembling shape wedged between two slabs of stone, half hidden beneath loose debris. The foal. Its coat looked dusty gray under the filtered light, though Jack couldn't tell if that was its natural color or a layer of dirt clinging to it. Its chest rose and fell in shallow pulses. Jack's own breath tightened with each flicker of the tiny creature's ribs. He wasn't sure how long it had been down there, but the weight of its exhaustion seemed heavy enough to anchor the desert air itself. Dakota lowered its head beside Jack's shoulder, nostrils flaring as though counting each faint breath below. The Mustang let out a soft, trembling nicker that almost didn't sound like it came from such a powerful body. Jack glanced at the stallion, noting the rigid lines of muscle under its ash-black coat. It made sense now. Why Dakota had jumped. Why the horse had looked back at him. Why it had led him here with that unwavering determination. Dakota had known. Somehow, through instinct or memory or whatever wild sense carried meaning between animals, it had understood that the foal was in danger. Jack leaned back, wiping dirt from his palms onto his jeans, though his hands continued to shake slightly. Not from fear, but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that always rose when he found someone, or something, trapped. It reminded him of other crevices, other narrow spaces where lives teetered between remaining and slipping away. He didn't linger on those memories. Not now. He focused on the present, on the small form below, on the way Dakota paced once, twice, then stood statue still again. A rough scrape of stone drifted from the crevice as the foal shifted, letting out another cry so faint Jack almost missed it. He moved closer to the edge, placing more weight on his knees while gripping the nearest outcrop of rock. The ground beneath him felt less stable than before, a brittle crust over a hollow uncertainty. He tested the support, pressing down slowly. A small chunk of stone snapped loose, bouncing down the slope and disappearing into the shadows. Dakota jerked its head up sharply at the sound, body tensing as though preparing to dive in after the falling debris. Jack lifted his hand in a slow gesture, steadying the stallion without touching it. "Easy," he murmured. The word drifted down as softly as dust. Dakota exhaled hard through its nose, stamping one hoof as if insisting they didn't have time for caution. But Jack knew better. Recklessness helped no one, not in fires, not in rescues, and certainly not now. He pushed himself back from the rim just enough to kneel on safer ground, scanning the terrain for a more accessible point of entry. The walls of the crevice narrowed sharply in some places, widened in others. It wasn't just a clean break in the earth, it was the result of old erosion, sudden collapse, and years of hidden stress waiting to give way. The descent would require precision, and any misstep could collapse more stone over the foal. The Mustang approached the edge again, stretching its neck as if trying to reach the trapped creature with its breath alone. Jack placed a hand on Dakota's shoulder, feeling the horse's trembling muscles tighten beneath his palm. The stallion turned its head slightly, enough for its dark eye to meet his. There was fear there. Fear not for itself, but for the life below. Jack felt the weight of that emotion press into him, deepening his resolve. "Hold on," he whispered to the foal, though the creature couldn't hear him over the distance and the shadows. "We'll get you out." The wind shifted, lifting a few grains of sand into the air and carrying them across Jack's face. He blinked, squinting against the brightening sun as he examined the crevice once more. A narrow ridge of stone jutted outward a few feet to the right, thick enough to hold some weight, thin enough to demand precise footing. It led to a sloping channel that descended toward the bottom of the crevice at a safer angle. Jack's mind worked through the possibilities. He could climb down the ridge, ease into the channel, reach the foal, and free it. But even as the plan formed, he knew it wasn't enough. He couldn't lift the foal out alone, not without proper gear or another set of hands. And the more he studied the space below, the more he sensed this wasn't just a matter of lifting the foal. Something else moved in the shadows, something larger. Dakota stiffened again, and Jack followed its gaze downward. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a shift of movement, slow, weary. Another animal lay partially hidden behind a broken slab of stone. A dog. Or what looked like one, though its fur was matted with dust and its body curled protectively toward the foal. Jack leaned closer, breath catching as he recognized the posture. Shielded, weak, but not giving in. The dog must have been trapped down there with the foal, its instincts overriding exhaustion as it fought to keep the young horse safe. The sight pulled a deep ache from Jack's chest. Loyalty like that didn't form overnight. These two had survived together, clung to each other, and now they were too weak to climb, too cold to endure much longer. He rose quickly, determination sharpening every movement. Dakota stepped closer, bumping Jack's shoulder with a rough push. Jack steadied himself and looked into the Mustang's eyes, then nodded once, firm and certain. "I need help," he said, "and I need it fast." Dakota snorted as if in agreement, its breath strong and warm. Jack reached for the pocket where he kept his phone, though he already knew what he would see. No service. Not out here. Not in this vast expanse of land that swallowed signals and secrets alike. He sighed and scanned the horizon, calculating distances, sunlight, time. If he left now, he could reach Samira in time. She lived close enough to get here before the heat fully settled into the day. But leaving the foal and the dog alone, even for a short time, gnawed at him. Dakota nudged his arm again, softer this time, a reassurance. Jack took a breath, let it fill him, let it settle into the spaces that had felt empty for far too long. "I'll be back," he whispered, voice low but steady. "Stay with them." Dakota lowered its head toward the crevice, watching the small lives below with fierce attention. Jack stood, wiped his palms against the dust on his jeans, and took one last look into the shadowed hollow where the foal whimpered again, a fragile plea drifting through stone and sunlight. Then he turned toward the open desert and ran. Jack's footsteps pounded against the desert floor as he sprinted back toward the distant ridge, each breath cutting into his chest with the dry sharpness of the Arizona air. The sun had risen higher, glazing the land with a hard, unforgiving light, and his shadow stretched long across the earth as if trying to keep pace with him. Behind him, the crevice, and everything trapped inside it, waited under the watch of a single Mustang. Dakota's silhouette lingered in Jack's mind with every stride, unwavering, anchored to the earth like a guardian carved from the land itself. The image pushed him onward, faster than he'd run in years. By the time Jack reached the edge of his property, sweat clung to his face and stung his eyes. He grabbed his truck keys from the workbench and climbed into the old pickup with hands that trembled from more than exertion. The engine sputtered before catching, rattling like an aging heartbeat, and Jack murmured a silent plea for it to hold together a little longer. The truck lurched forward, kicking up clouds of red dust as he sped down the winding road toward Samira's clinic. The desert blurred past the windows, but Jack's mind stayed fixed on the shadows beneath the rocks. The foal's weak cries, the dog curled around it, and Dakota's trembling breath as it stood over the crevice. He kept replaying the moment he'd first looked down into that crack in the earth, the moment everything inside him had shifted. There was something in the way the foal had tried to lift its head, something in the ragged rise and fall of its chest that had struck him deeply. It was the same look he'd seen in survivors of wildfires, a fragile, stubborn will to live, clinging to the last threads of strength. Samira's clinic appeared at the horizon, a small building made of pale stucco and tin roofing that glinted under the sun. Jack pulled in hard enough to jolt the truck, then climbed out before the engine fully settled. He didn't need to knock. Samira was already stepping outside, shades pushed onto her head, eyes narrowing at the sight of him. "You look like you outran a dust storm," she said, though concern softened her voice. "There's a foal," Jack said breathlessly, "and a dog, trapped deep in a crevice about 3 miles north of the ridge. They're alive, but barely." Samira didn't waste a second. She nodded sharply, turned on her heel, and disappeared into the clinic. Jack heard crates clatter, supplies shifting, the muffled jangle of metal and rope. She re-emerged with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder, a coil of cord in one hand, and her med kit in the other. Her efficiency reminded Jack of the firefighters he once worked beside, people who knew how to answer urgency without letting panic seep into their hands. "Your truck holding up?" she asked. "Barely," he admitted. She tossed the gear into the back seat. "Barely will do." They were on the road within seconds, heading back the way Jack had come. The truck rattled, but he kept it steady as Samira reviewed the terrain he described. As they climbed the gradual incline toward the ridge, she braced herself against the dash, leaning forward as though her anticipation dragged the vehicle faster. "You said Dakota is with them?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Didn't leave the edge." Samira let out a slow breath. That horse, he trusts you more than you think. It's not about trust, Jack said, hands tightening around the wheel. He was trying to tell me something this whole time. I'm just glad I listened. They reached the final stretch where the truck could go no farther. Jack killed the engine, and both climbed out quickly. Samira slung her bag across her back and secured the rope around her chest. The sun had climbed higher, washing everything in a harsh white glow that deepened the shadows around the canyon walls. They started toward the ridge, their footsteps crunching over dry brush and loose gravel. As they approached the crevice, Jack scanned the horizon, searching for the familiar ash-black shape. Dakota was still there, exactly where Jack had left the Mustang. The stallion stood firm at the edge, tail flicking slowly, its attention locked on the crack in the ground. When Dakota noticed Jack and Samira approaching, it lifted its head but didn't move from its post. Jack felt something in his chest unclench at the sight. He hasn't left them, he said quietly. Samira nodded. Good horse. Dakota took a single step back to give them room, though the Mustang's muscles remained taut. Jack knelt at the rim once more, and Samira crouched beside him, adjusting her grip on the rope before peering into the shadows below. The foal hadn't moved much. The small tremors Jack had seen earlier had faded, replaced by a stillness that pressed cold fingers around his heart. The dog was still curled around the young horse, its breaths shallow but steady. Samira exhaled sharply. We don't have long. She examined the angle of the rock, testing the ground with her boots. Jack watched her every move, ready to steady her if the earth shifted. The crevice seemed deeper now, as though the weight of time had settled further into its bones. Samira secured one end of the rope around a thick outcrop of stone, one Jack had checked earlier for stability, and looped the other around her waist. You're sure it'll hold? She asked. I checked it twice. Jack swallowed. It's the best anchor we've got. She glanced at Dakota. Watch him. If he moves too close, that edge might give. Dakota flicked an ear, as though understanding. Jack positioned himself at the rim, bracing the rope with both hands as Samira began her descent. She moved with careful precision, placing her boots in the narrow grooves of stone. Loose dust fell with every step, drifting down to the foal and dog below in soft spirals. Samira reached the wider ledge halfway down and paused, steadying herself before lowering further. Jack kept the rope firm, sweat gathering between his shoulder blades. Dakota remained beside him, the Mustang's breath sharp and focused. When Samira reached the bottom, she crouched beside the foal, her movements soft and respectful. Jack couldn't hear what she murmured, but the foal responded with the faintest twitch of an ear. Samira signaled for Jack to loosen the rope. He did so carefully, giving her enough slack to maneuver around the animals. She moved the dog first, checking its limbs and lifting it gently onto the small ridge near the wall. Then she turned her full attention to the foal. Jack leaned farther over the edge, watching every motion as Samira inspected the foal's trapped leg. She freed it slowly, cautious not to cause more pain or injury. The foal let out a thin, cracked whine, and Dakota answered with a soft, trembling nicker from above. It's going to be all right, Jack whispered. He wasn't sure whether he was comforting the foal, the Mustang, or himself. Samira positioned the foal for ascent, fastening a sling around its body with practiced hands. She tugged lightly on the rope to alert Jack. He tightened his grip, bracing his feet against the ground. Ready, Samira called. Jack pulled. The rope strained as the foal rose inch by inch, its small body suspended against the jagged stone. Jack gritted his teeth, muscles tightening with each deliberate lift. Dakota stepped closer, hovering just behind him, breath warm and insistent. Finally, the foal cleared the edge. Jack guided the young horse onto stable ground, lowering it gently to the sand. Dakota bent its head immediately, brushing its muzzle along the foal's neck in tender, trembling strokes. The foal, weak as it was, leaned into the touch. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Below, Samira prepared the dog for its ascent, the sun. Shadows in the crevice felt less menacing now, less like a mouth waiting to swallow, and more like a silence that had finally been given an answer. The dog whined softly as Samira secured the sling beneath its body, her fingers moving with the same careful steadiness she used on every frightened creature that crossed her clinic's threshold. Jack tightened his grip on the rope, feeling the coarse fibers press into his palms. Dakota stood close beside him, the Mustang's flank nearly brushing his shoulder, its breath warm and uneven, as though the horse felt every tremor of urgency vibrating through the canyon. Jack kept one eye on the rope, the other on the shifting stones at the edge, ready to anchor himself if the ground gave way. "Easy now," Samira called from below, her voice echoing faintly along the canyon walls. She adjusted the dog's position one more time before giving the rope a firm tug. Jack steadied himself, planting his boots deeper into the sand before beginning to pull. The dog rose slowly, its body swaying gently as Jack guided it up the narrow chute of rock. Dakota tucked its head nearer, ears pressed forward, its attention locked on the fragile life dangling between earth and sky. Jack felt each inch of strain not only in his arms, but in his breath, in the beat of his heart, in the way the desert's silence pressed against them. The rope creaked as it tightened, scraping against stone. A small shower of dust fell from above, drifting over the dog's fur like a gray veil before disappearing into the wind. Jack pulled harder, muscles burning, jaw clenched. Finally, with one last heave, he lifted the dog over the edge and lowered it gently onto the sand. Its body softened the moment it felt solid ground beneath it, and the dog let out a rattled breath that made Jack's throat tighten. "That's it," Samira called. "I'm coming up." Jack glanced toward the crevice, making sure the foal lay safely near Dakota. The young horse rested its head on the sand, eyes half closed, but breathing more evenly now, its small chest rising and falling with a fragile rhythm that reassured him. Dakota hovered over it like a shadow stitched to sunlight, the Mustang's movements softer than he'd seen all morning. Something in that tenderness struck him deeply, a reminder that the horse's fierce determination was rooted in loyalty rather than fear. He reached out and touched Dakota's shoulder lightly. The stallion didn't pull away. Samira climbed up much faster, her boots finding natural footholds along the ridge. Jack steadied the rope as she neared the top, extending a hand when she was within reach. She grasped his wrist firmly. He pulled her the rest of the way onto stable ground. As she brushed the dust from her knees, her gaze fell immediately on the foal and the dog. "They're alive," she said, half in disbelief, half in gratitude. "They need care, soon, but they're fighters." Jack nodded. They held on longer than they should have. Samira knelt beside the dog, checking its breathing, then ran her hands gently over the foal's flank. The young Mustang gave a soft, wavering sound, leaning slightly toward the warmth of her touch. Jack felt a wave of relief wash through him, not loud or overwhelming, but something quieter, like cool water seeping into cracked earth. But the relief didn't linger. The sun had climbed further, heating the canyon floor. The wind had shifted again, carrying with it the dry whisper of a coming change. A subtle temperature drop that made Jack glance instinctively at the sky. A thin veil of clouds gathered along the horizon, forming the kind of pale haze that preceded desert winds. Samira noticed it too. "We need to move," she said. "Weather's shifting." Jack nodded. "I'll carry the foal. You take the dog." Samira hesitated before shaking her head. "We should build a stretcher for the foal. It's too weak. We move it wrong, we lose it." Jack scanned the area, searching for anything that could support a makeshift stretcher. The desert offered little, but necessity had always been his quiet teacher. He spotted a few long branches from a dead mesquite tree near the ridge, sun-bleached and sturdy. He retrieved them, then unrolled a canvas tarp from Samira's bag. Together, they lashed the branches to the canvas, fashioning a stretcher wide enough for the foal to rest upon. Dakota watched every movement, head lowered, nostrils fluttering with each shift of wind. When Jack approached the foal to lift it onto the stretcher, the Mustang stepped forward, not aggressively, but protectively. Jack paused, meeting Dakota's eyes. "It's all right," he said softly. Dakota held still for a moment, then slowly backed away just enough for Jack to kneel beside the foal. He slipped his arms under its small body, careful of its injured leg. The foal whimpered, a thin, strained sound, and Jack murmured quiet reassurance as he lifted it onto the canvas. Dakota nosed the foal gently, as if checking that it was still breathing, then stepped beside Jack, while Samira secured the dog in her arms. "We'll need to take it slow," Samira said as she adjusted her grip. "And steady." Jack nodded. "Dakota can help keep pace." The stallion flicked an ear at its name, as though agreeing. They began the slow trek across the canyon floor, Jack carrying the front of the stretcher while Dakota walked beside the rear, nudging the frame every so often to keep it balanced. Samira followed a few steps behind, holding the dog against her chest. The desert air grew thicker, charged with a stillness that signaled weather brewing somewhere beyond the horizon. Jack recognized that quiet. A waiting quiet. The kind that settled before wind swept the land clean. As they climbed the gentle slope that led back to the ridge, Jack felt the weight of the stretcher press into his shoulders. The foal's shallow breaths fanned against the canvas. Dakota walked close enough that Jack could hear the soft thud of its hooves with every deliberate step. The Mustang's presence steadied him more than he wanted to admit. He had carried injured beings before, people, animals, strangers, and teammates. But this was different. Dakota wasn't merely following. It was walking with purpose, matching Jack's pace, as though the two were bound by an unspoken thread. When they reached the ridge, a gust of wind swept across the landscape, lifting dust into the air. Samira shielded the dog with her jacket, and Jack turned his body to block the foal from the worst of the dust. Dakota lowered its head, pressing close to the stretcher, its mane whipping in the breeze. The Mustang let out a low rumble of concern, so soft Jack felt it more than heard it. The sky dimmed slightly as the thin layer of clouds drifted overhead, veiling the sun in a pale softness. Jack took a breath and adjusted his grip on the stretcher. They weren't far from the truck now, far from getting the foal and dog the care they deserved. Samira caught his eye and offered a small nod of encouragement. "We're almost there," she said. "Keep going." Jack looked ahead, the path stretching in a winding line across the open desert. Dakota stood beside him, steady as a shadow at his side. Together, they pressed forward, carrying the silent hope that the small lives they'd rescued still had enough strength left to take one more breath, and then another, and then the countless breaths that would follow, if they could just make it home. The last stretch toward Jack's truck unfolded slower than any of them expected. Twilight had begun to settle across the desert, washing the land in muted violets and smoky rose tones that blurred the edges of distance. The wind carried a sharper bite now, pushing grains of sand across the ground in soft, whispering ribbons. Jack adjusted his grip on the makeshift stretcher, feeling the strain in his shoulders deepen with every careful step. Dakota stayed beside him, matching his pace as though tethered to the moment, guiding its movements with a calmness that contrasted the tightening chill in the air. By the time they crested the final rise, dusk had slipped fully into evening. Jack's truck appeared as a faint shape, nestled between two clusters of mesquite, its metal exterior catching the last of the day's light. Samira let out a quiet breath of relief, though she held the dog closer as the wind surged again, lifting the edges of her jacket. Jack tilted his chin toward the horizon, noting the darkening band of clouds accumulating like a slow-moving tide. Weather came quickly in the desert, silent until the moment it wasn't. "Let's get them inside before the temperature drops," Samira said, her voice softer than the wind, but weighted with urgency. Jack set down the stretcher, easing the foal onto the ground. Dakota stood over the young horse protectively, its breath steady, though its ears flicked nervously at each gust of wind slicing through the open space. Jack placed a hand on the Mustang's shoulder. "You've done more than enough," he murmured. "Let us handle the rest." Dakota didn't step back. Not fully, but its trembling eased as Jack lifted the foal again and carefully moved it toward the truck. Samira opened the back door, spreading a thick blanket across the floor. Jack settled the foal onto the blanket, making sure its injured leg was properly supported before stepping aside for Samira to check its breathing. She ran her hands along its ribs, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's weak," she whispered, "but it's still fighting." The dog whimpered softly in her arms. She knelt and set it down beside the foal, letting the two touch, drawing comfort from their shared warmth. Jack closed the truck door gently before turning back toward Dakota, who remained near the foot of the ridge, head turned to the dark horizon. The Mustang's body was outlined by the faint glow of moonrise, and for a moment Jack felt as though he were looking at a creature carved from the night itself, half light, half memory. "We're taking them home," Jack said quietly. "You coming with us?" Dakota shifted its weight, but didn't move. The Mustang's gaze snapped again to the darkening sky. Jack followed its line of sight, noticing how the clouds now stacked like blurred steps, thickening at the center. The first breath of cold reached him, sliding under his collar, and he understood. Dakota wasn't waiting for permission to join them. The horse was preparing for the long walk home, however far it needed to follow. A sudden gust cut between them, sending a swirl of dust across the truck bed. Jack felt the grain sting against his cheek. He tugged his jacket tighter. "We need to hurry," Samira said from behind him. Jack nodded. He grabbed the rope tied to the stretcher, rolled it quickly, secured it in the truck bed, and climbed into the driver's seat. Samira eased into the passenger side, casting one last look at the foal and the dog nestled together. Jack turned the key. The engine sputtered but caught, rumbling into life like an exhausted old guardian rising for duty one last time. "Come on," Jack called through the open window. Dakota approached the truck slowly, hooves padding softly across the hardening ground. It walked alongside the driver's side, its head level with Jack's shoulder through the window. Jack reached out and brushed his fingers once along the Mustang's jawline. Dakota's breath warmed his hand briefly before the Mustang shifted to the side, preparing to follow. Jack placed his foot on the gas, moving the truck forward at a slow crawl. Dakota fell into step beside them, its stride steady, its presence grounding the uncertainty weaving through the night. The desert grew dimmer as the moon ascended, slipping behind clouds that masked its full glow. The headlights carved a narrow path ahead, illuminating the swirling dust that rose in fleeting shapes before dissolving into the dark. As they navigated the uneven terrain, Jack felt the truck jolt with each dip in the ground. Samira kept her hand on the foal's side, murmuring to it whenever it stirred. The dog lay quietly, chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. The interior of the truck smelled faintly of dust, canvas, and something else. Hope, maybe, or the remnants of fear passing into something quieter. Dakota continued to follow, its silhouette a constant presence in the corner of Jack's vision. Every so often, the Mustang would glance into the window as if checking on the foal's condition. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Dakota had done this before, guided something, protected something, walked through uncertainty for the sake of another. The thought lingered as the wind shoved against the truck again, rattling the frame. Samira leaned forward slightly. "Storm's coming in faster." Jack pressed his lips together. "We'll beat it." The truck crept down the final slope before the land leveled into the wide approach to his ranch. The familiar outline of his porch rose ahead, its wooden beams casting elongated shadows under the hazy moon. Dakota slowed when they reached the open yard, circling once before stopping near the corral it had leapt from earlier that morning. Jack parked the truck near the barn, shutting off the engine. The sudden quiet settled around them, broken only by the soft hum of wind and the low groan of the cooling engine. Jack stepped out and immediately felt the temperature drop further, the cold brushing across his skin with sharp, thin fingers. "Let's get them inside," Samira said, opening the back door. Jack lifted the foal again, carrying it into the barn where the scent of old hay and wood dust greeted him. Samira followed with the dog, laying it gently onto a padded stall mat. Jack laid the foal beside it, brushing dust from its coat. Dakota appeared at the barn door moments later, pausing at the threshold as though unsure whether to enter. Jack stepped back and gestured toward him. "Come on in. You've earned that much." Dakota hesitated, one hoof hovering briefly above the ground, before stepping inside. The Mustang's presence filled the barn with a quiet weight. It took its place beside the foal, lowering its head until their foreheads almost touched. Jack watched the small exchange, feeling the night press in from all sides. Samira checked the foal's pulse again. "It's stable," she murmured. "For now." Jack nodded, leaning against one of the wooden beams. His pulse matched the slower settling rhythm of the barn, as if the chaos outside couldn't reach this space. Dakota remained by the foal's side, steady and silent. Outside, the storm gathered itself, its winds beginning to ripple through the desert grasses. Inside, in the quiet glow of a single hanging bulb, 3 animals lay breathing. Alive. Because Dakota had led them here. And because Jack had listened. The storm broke sometime after midnight, though it never announced itself with thunder or the kind of violence Jack remembered from wildfire seasons. Instead, it arrived quietly, wind slipping through cracks in the barn walls, dust lifting in soft spirals, the rafters creaking as if shifting in their sleep. Jack sat on a stool near the stall, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely as he watched the foal breathe shallow, rhythmic breaths beside the dog. Samira had fallen into an exhausted doze against a hay bale, her jacket pulled over her shoulders. Dakota stood guard near the entrance, the Mustang's silhouette carved against the faint glow of the lantern hanging from a hook. Jack could feel the storm's weight in the air, but inside the barn, something gentler held the space together. A fragile warmth threaded between flickering lantern light and the sound of soft breathing. He watched Dakota lower its head to nudge the foal's cheek, an instinctive kind of tenderness that seemed older than anything Jack could remember. The foal responded with a faint sigh, shifting closer to the warmth of the dog curled at its side. A long, quiet moment settled over the barn. Jack leaned back against the wooden post behind him, letting his eyes close for a heartbeat. He hadn't felt this kind of exhaustion in years, the honest kind, where the body surrendered, but the spirit remained steady. He opened his eyes again and found Dakota watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The Mustang's eyes held shadows and questions, but also something steady, something resembling trust. A rare gift from a creature that had every reason to withhold it. "You did good today," Jack murmured, his voice low so as not to wake Samira. Dakota flicked an ear, acknowledging the tone, if not the words. Outside, wind brushed the desert floor in long strokes, lifting and setting the world back down again. Jack stood slowly, joints creaking, and walked toward the barn door where Dakota stood. The Mustang shifted slightly to make space, but didn't step away. Jack rested his hand lightly on Dakota's neck. The horse didn't flinch. Instead, it exhaled, a long, tired breath that fogged faintly in the cooling air. The quiet between them grew deeper, settling into a stillness that felt shared rather than empty. Jack had known silence in many forms, lonely, bitter, heavy, but this one felt different, softer, like sand smoothing over sharp edges. Outside the barn, the storm eased. The wind's sharp whistle dulled into a low murmur, the kind that carried stories rather than warnings. Jack turned back toward the foal. The lantern's light played across the young horse's thin flank, revealing the rise and fall of its breathing. Slow, steady, fragile, but present. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, subtle but real. For hours, earlier he'd carried fear like a stone inside him. Fear that the foal might slip away before morning, that Dakota's desperate determination had come too late. But now, watching the small creature draw in breath after breath, Jack felt something loosen inside him. Samira stirred, waking with a soft groan. She rubbed her eyes and sat up straighter, glancing at the foal first, then at Jack. "It made it through the worst," she whispered. Jack nodded. "Looks like it." She stretched her stiff shoulders, then moved to check the foal's pulse again. Dakota watched her closely, ears twitching as her hands moved with clinical precision. "You know," she said gently, "not many people would have followed a horse across the desert without question." Jack let out a faint laugh. Wasn't much of a question to ask. Samira smiled. "Maybe not for you, but most folks trust maps more than instincts." Jack leaned against the stall door, eyes drifting toward the foal again. "Instinct's what kept me alive half my career. Hard to turn it off." Samira didn't reply, but her expression softened in a way that told Jack she understood more than she said. She tucked the blanket securely around the foal and dog, then stood and brushed hay dust from her jeans. Dakota stepped closer, its breath stirring a curl of her hair. Samira reached up and touched the Mustang's muzzle with careful respect. "You saved them," she whispered. Dakota blinked slowly, seeming almost embarrassed by the credit. The lantern flickered as a fresh gust brushed against the barn walls. The storm hadn't fully passed. Its remnants lingered like a long exhale. But the air inside had softened, its sharp edges worn down by warmth and proximity, and the quiet resilience of the creatures huddled within. Jack reached for a small thermos on the nearby shelf, unscrewing the lid to sip the now lukewarm coffee he'd brought from the house. The bitter taste grounded him, pulled him back from the haze of worry and relief. He offered the thermos to Samira, who accepted it gratefully. As she drank, she studied him with an expression that hovered somewhere between curiosity and understanding. "You're different tonight," she said. "How do you mean?" She handed the thermos back. "You've carried shadows around you since the day we met. Tonight, they don't look as heavy." Jack looked toward the foal, toward the dog, toward Dakota standing tall despite exhaustion. "Maybe I'm just tired," he said softly. Samira chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe you remembered something you forgot. You don't have to do everything alone." Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his hand rest on Dakota's neck again. The Mustang didn't pull away, just shifted slightly so their shoulders aligned. Samira watched with a thoughtful expression before stepping back, giving them both space. The storm quieted to a faint whisper. Outside, the desert breathed again. Inside, Jack felt the wind soften inside him too, loosening something he hadn't even realized he was holding. Dakota lowered its head once more, gently brushing the foal's cheek with its muzzle. The foal stirred, responding to the touch. Jack exhaled deeply, letting the silence sit between them as comfortably as an old friend. For the first time in a long while, the night didn't feel so heavy. Morning seeped slowly into the desert, not with the usual blaze of gold, but with a soft, pale light that clung to the edges of every surface. Jack's barn, the mesquite trees, the quiet stretch of land that led toward the ridge. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape washed clean, as though the night had peeled away a layer of dust that had long settled on more than just the earth. The air was cool, gentler than it had been in days, carrying with it the faint scent of damp sand. Jack stood at the barn doorway, taking in that new softness, while Dakota stood beside him, shoulder nearly touching his arm. The foal and the dog slept peacefully in the stall, their bodies curled into each other, slow and steady breaths rising beneath the blanket Samira had tucked around them before leaving just before dawn. She had wanted to stay, but Jack insisted she rest at home, promising he would watch over the animals until she returned with more supplies. Now, alone with Dakota and the quiet hum of morning, Jack felt a sense of responsibility that was both heavy and strangely restorative. He hadn't slept, but fatigue didn't weigh on him the way it usually did. Instead, he felt something else, an awareness, a clarity that had sharpened during the night. The desert beyond his barn glowed with a muted sheen, the kind that reminded him of early mornings on the fire line, when dawn brought the promise of a long day, but also the relief of surviving the night. He remembered stepping out into cool air like this before, many times, in many places, carrying the knowledge that the worst had passed, and something new was beginning. Dakota nudged his arm lightly, breaking his thoughts. Jack looked at the Mustang, noticing the dust clinging to its coat in faint patches. Dakota's eyes were softer this morning, no longer filled with the sharp urgency of yesterday. Instead, they held a slow, burning warmth, steady, unwavering, a silent gratitude that made Jack's chest tighten. "You want to see them, don't you?" Jack said quietly. Dakota flicked an ear, the faintest acknowledgement. Jack stepped inside, and the Mustang followed, hooves muffled on the barn's packed dirt floor. The foal stirred at the sound, lifting its head just enough for its ears to twitch toward the doorway. Jack approached slowly, crouching beside the stall. The foal blinked sleepily, then gave a soft, raspy whine. Dakota lowered its head, brushing its muzzle gently along the foal's neck. The young horse leaned into the touch. Jack felt the moment settle deep inside him, an echo of something both old and new. There was no dramatic surge of emotion, no defining revelation, only a quiet knowing, the kind that didn't need explanation. Dakota had brought him here yesterday, not by accident, not because of panic or instinct, but because the Mustang trusted him with something fragile. And Jack had answered that trust without question. He stood again, stretching the stiffness from his back. The foal watched him calmly, the terror that once filled its eyes gone now, replaced by something resembling peace. The dog shifted in its sleep, but didn't wake. Jack opened the barn doors wider, letting the cool morning air sweep through the space. Dakota stepped outside first, surveying the ranch with a presence that felt almost protective. Jack followed, letting the door swing open behind him. The land looked different today, softer, more forgiving. The sun's early rays brushed against the sand, turning the shadows of the fence posts into long, slender lines stretching toward the horizon. Jack walked toward the porch without thinking, his boots leaving shallow prints in the damp earth. Dakota trailed beside him, the horse's steps almost soundless. At the edge of the porch, Jack paused. He looked back toward the barn, where the foal and dog rested, then out toward the far ridge, where yesterday's trail had begun. That path looked impossibly distant now, as though the last 24 hours had stretched far beyond the boundaries of time. He exhaled slowly, letting the warmth of the rising sun touch his face. When he had found Dakota at the livestock yard months earlier, the Mustang had been all sharp angles and wary eyes, an animal that trusted nothing and no one. Jack hadn't known then why he felt compelled to take the horse home. He just knew that something inside him recognized a familiar kind of brokenness. But watching Dakota now, framed against the brightening sky, Jack realized he had underestimated the Mustang. Dakota wasn't broken. The world had simply misunderstood the kind of strength it carried. The barn door creaked lightly as a breeze passed through, and the sound pulled Jack back toward the present. He turned, walking down the porch steps and crossing the yard again. Dakota followed close behind, keeping stride with a level of ease that made Jack feel as though they'd been moving together like this for years. Inside the barn, the foal lifted its head again. Jack crouched beside it, resting one hand lightly on its flank. Its breathing was stronger now, each rise and fall more confident than the last. The foal nudged his palm gently, its warm breath brushing against his fingers. "You're going to make it," Jack whispered. He wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the foal or to himself. Dakota stood in the doorway, watching them with steady eyes. The Mustang's mane stirred slightly with each breeze. For a moment, the three of them, man, wild horse, fragile foal, shared a stillness that was larger than the barn walls. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was simply true. Jack stood again and approached Dakota, placing a hand on the horse's neck. The Mustang leaned in slightly, just enough to acknowledge the gesture. The morning breeze softened, sweeping gently around them. Jack closed his eyes briefly and let the warmth settle over him. When he opened them again, Dakota had shifted its weight, turning its head just enough to glance toward the open yard, as if offering an invitation. Jack followed the gesture, stepping out into the sunlight beside the Mustang. The path home had already begun long before they reached the ranch last night. It had begun the moment Dakota leapt the corral fence and trusted him to follow. The desert stretched ahead, wide and bright, waiting without demand or threat. Jack took a deep breath and began walking, Dakota falling into step beside him. The walk back home had never been about distance. It was about returning to a place inside himself he thought he had lost long ago, one that Dakota had quietly led him back to, stride by stride, breath by breath. And as they walked into the softening wind, Jack understood something simple and profound. He hadn't rescued Dakota. Dakota had rescued him. The first light of day crept gently over the desert, spreading thin strokes of pink and silver across the horizon. Jack stood outside the barn, one hand resting on the worn wooden frame as the last traces of the night faded behind him. The world smelled of cool sand and distant rain, an echo of the storm that had passed, leaving the air washed clean. He watched Dakota standing in the open yard, the Mustang's ash-dusted coat shimmering softly beneath the early sun. There was something different about Dakota this morning, something quieter, as if the world inside the horse had finally stilled in ways Jack had never witnessed before. Inside the barn, the foal stirred. Jack turned from the doorway and stepped inside, taking his time, letting his footsteps meet the soft earth with the same gentleness he used to approach frightened animals long ago. The foal lifted its head as he approached the stall. Its breathing was steadier now, deeper, each rise of its chest a testament that its fragile hold on life had strengthened. The dog stretched beside it with a small groan, then rested its head back down, content with the closeness of the young horse it had guarded in darkness. Jack knelt beside them again. He didn't speak. There was no need. The quiet of the barn carried its own words, warm, soft, and steady, the kind of quiet a man could rest inside. He reached out and stroked the foal's cheek, feeling the warmth beneath its thin coat. For a moment, Jack let his eyes close. He hadn't realized how long he'd been bracing himself, how much of his life had been lived in the aftermath of moments he could not undo. But now, kneeling beside this young life that had survived against the odds, he felt something shift inside him. Something long buried. A soft sound echoed from the barn entrance. When Jack opened his eyes, he saw Dakota standing there, framed by sunlight. The Mustang stepped forward slowly, its gait calm and assured. It stopped a few feet from the stall, lowering its head toward the foal. Jack moved aside, giving Dakota room. What happened next was simple, but it settled deep into Jack's chest. Dakota leaned close and exhaled gently across the foal's face. A breath, warm and deliberate, a reassurance. The foal blinked, then reached up to touch its muzzle to the Mustang's. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it held a lifetime's worth of meaning, loyalty, memory, and an unspoken promise that had carried them through the storm. Samira arrived not long after, her truck rolling to a quiet stop in the yard. She stepped out with the same tired grace she carried the night before, though her eyes brightened when she saw Jack standing beside Dakota. "They made it," she said softly. They did. She walked toward the stall, her boots whispering across the dirt. When she saw the foal lift its head, she covered her mouth and smiled. A small, private smile, the kind that belonged to moments when the world gave back something it had almost taken. Jack didn't say anything. He simply watched her, watched Dakota, watched the foal inch closer to the dog for warmth. It felt as if the barn had become something sacred overnight. Not because of the walls or the wood, but because of what had happened inside them. A storm had passed, yes, but so had something else. The weight Jack had carried for years. Samira brushed hay from her hands and stood. "You know," she said quietly, "I've never seen a Mustang stay like that. It didn't leave their side." Jack's eyes drifted to Dakota again. Maybe he didn't want them to disappear the way things used to. Samira studied him for a long moment, as though she could read the layers beneath his words. "Maybe he didn't want you to disappear either." Jack didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, but because some truths didn't need words. They needed silence. And this morning the silence felt full, not empty. Dakota stepped out into the yard, and Jack followed. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the land. The desert's colors brightened. The muted reds, the soft golds, the faint green of hardy shrubs clinging to life. Dakota walked ahead a few steps, then stopped and looked back at Jack. Not summoning him, not urging him, just looking. A simple acknowledgement. Jack walked to the stall fence and rested his hands on the top rail. Dakota moved closer, stopping at his side. The Mustang turned its head slightly and pressed its forehead against Jack's shoulder, so gently that Jack barely felt the weight, but deeply enough that he felt everything else. "Thank you," Jack whispered. The desert breeze carried the words away, but he knew Dakota heard them. Or felt them. Or simply understood, the way certain souls did without needing sound. They stood there for a long time. The man who had spent years trying not to feel too deeply, and the Mustang who had felt too deeply all along. The sun rose higher, the wind softened, and in that humble stillness, Jack realized something he should have known from the start. This wasn't just Dakota's story. It was his too. 2 lives, each carrying old wounds, finding their way back through a path neither could have walked alone. Behind them, the foal let out a small sound, weak, but alive. The dog shifted beside it. Samira hummed softly as she checked their vitals, and Dakota remained at Jack's side, breathing steadily. The silence held them all, warm and healing. And for the first time in a long time, Jack led it. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Share a simple comment below, even just a few words, and tell me what part stayed with you. And if you'd like to walk with us through more stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances, make sure to subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for you here.